All right, guys. So Piers Morgan is continuing in his streak of having on guests that just completely embarrass and humiliate and run circles around him. So here he's going to bring on Dr. Cornel West to discuss broadly Israel and Gaza, but more specifically, they're going to start off here talking about Aaron Bushnell, who is the U.S. airman who recently decided to partake in the most extreme form of protest that a human being can possibly engage in, and lit himself on fire outside of the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C., as a form of protest against what he called, and obviously that I would agree with, a genocide in Gaza that the U.S. is complicit in. And then they're also going to talk about the concept of terrorism, whether or not Hamas is a terrorist organization, whether or not the IDF is a terrorist organization. So it was a pretty, interesting back and forth here to say the least. But let's just go ahead and jump into it, and I'm going to commentate my way through it as we go.
Well, pressure is again intensifying on Israel after US Vice President Kamala Harris called for a ceasefire in Gaza and rebuked the humanitarian catastrophe there. Opinions on the war are sharply divided in America, Israel's most important ally, a fact laid bare by the death of US Airman Aaron Bushnell last week. The 25-year-old set himself alight outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., shouting "Free Palestine" and declaring he would no longer be complicit in genocide. Well, presidential candidate Dr. Cornel West stirred up controversy by posting the following to X. Let us never forget the extraordinary courage and commitment of brother Aaron Bushnell, who died for truth and justice. I pray for his precious loved ones. Let us rededicate ourselves to genuine solidarity with Palestinians undergoing genocidal attacks in real time. Well, many Jewish commentators said Dr. West's comments encourage political violence by those opposed to Israel's existence. Well, joining me now to discuss his controversial post is the independent presidential candidate, Professor Cornel West. Cornel, great to see you. Thank you very much for coming back on Uncensored.
Always a blessing to be in conversation with you, my brother.
Okay, I gotta say, obviously they're going to continue here, but characterizing what Aaron Bushnell did, as Piers just mentioned there, as some sort of a threat of political violence against Israelis or against Jewish people, what does that even mean? I mean, this guy self-immolated. Okay, there was no threat to anybody there. There was no threat to the people in the Israeli embassy. There was no threat to Jewish people in the United States or anywhere else around the world. It was self-immolation. The only damage that was caused was to himself, okay? And he died for that. And so to try to reframe that or spin that as some sort of a threat to Jewish people or an anti-Semitic demonstration, or even something that was calling out the existence of Israel. I mean, what he said in the lead up to him going and lighting himself on fire was he was calling out U.S. complicity in a genocide. That is not even the same thing as saying that Israel shouldn't exist, right? Which may be something that Aaron Bushnell believed in, but that's not even what he was talking about at the time. And it's certainly not a threat to Jewish people in any way, shape, or form. It is a call out of U.S. complicity in genocide. But they continue.
And the feeling is very mutual. Let me just ask you. Many people were pretty surprised by the tone of your tweet, not least the fact that you would categorise what Aaron Bushnell did as extraordinary courage and commitment. Many people think it was the act of somebody quite possibly very seriously mentally ill, taking his life in dramatic circumstances, and that was not necessarily consistent with being courageous or committed.
Well, one is that you think of Cato the Younger when he killed himself as the Roman Empire began to emerge and the Roman Republic was collapsing. And Cato's killing of himself has become one of the grand examples of moral courage and a willingness to bear witness as to something that he deeply opposed. Now, I think it's very interesting that so many of the people who were critical of me talking about the courage of my dear brother Aaron, that they don't understand the depths and scope of the suffering right now in Gaza. And too many of them actually are even indifferent to the genocide. They're indifferent to the ethnic cleansing. They're indifferent to the apartheid-like conditions. And so I can understand them saying, well, I am promoting violence by acknowledging the tremendous courage in engaging a moral witness in which you kill yourself as a way of calling attention, not to yourself, but to suffering of precious Palestinians in Gaza. That's what Aaron was doing. In the same way Cato was doing the same thing when they saw Julius Caesar moving into the highest position, and it was clear that the republic was coming to a close and the empire was being established.
Okay, but
and there's a whole host of examples of people who bear witness by killing themselves.
Let me ask you this then.
Okay, before he asks the next question, first off, self-immolation is, obviously horrific. It's a horrible thing to watch, to experience for obvious reasons, but this is not a new thing. Okay, self-immolation has been a tactic that has been used for decades, if not centuries, as a form of political protest. And so it's really interesting to me how Piers Morgan, without really any evidence, at least that I've seen whatsoever, just asserts that this man, Aaron Bushnell, had to have been under some sort of like a delusion, that he had to have had some sort of underlying deep mental illness or something, and that there was no political legitimacy to the protest that he engaged in. Now, again, I may be wrong. Maybe there's something I haven't seen out there, but I have not seen any evidence whatsoever that Aaron Bushnell had a, suicidal ideation or had some sort of underlying depressive disorder or anything relating to mental illness in any capacity whatsoever. And so to witness what he did, which is, again, the most extreme form of protest that a human being can possibly engage in, and to just brush that off as mental illness while completely ignoring all of the things that he said were his justification for doing this is, I think, disgraceful to his memory. Number one. Number two, what Cornel West just said there, I think is also really important about how so many people are so indifferent to the suffering, the immense, incalculable suffering that is happening in Gaza right now as a result of Israeli and U.S. government policy, that they could not fathom that somebody would take that sort of a drastic action as a form of protest. And I think that's an issue with you. I think that's an issue with anybody who thinks what Israel is doing right now is even remotely normal. Okay, this is not something that can be normalized. What we're witnessing right now is a genocide. Okay, we're talking about the entire, northern portion of Gaza being flattened into oblivion. We're talking about the southern portion of Gaza where over 1 million people are packed into essentially tent cities where people are now dying because of thirst and starvation, where tens of thousands of civilians have been killed, tens of more thousands have been injured, and hundreds of thousands have been traumatized for the rest of their lives, where schools and hospitals and UN shelters and refugee camps and mosques and churches, everything has been obliterated inside of Gaza. And so to look at that kind of a situation and to not have a dramatic reaction to it, to not put the suffering in Gaza caused by Israel, caused by the United States, first and foremost, you're already making a massive mistake there in your analysis. Right? But they continue here.
Suicide. No, that's not the point. It's the cause that they're bearing witness to. And that's where my difference with so many of my deeply conservative and moderate Jewish brothers and sisters comes in. If they're indifferent to the suffering in Gaza, then it's going to be difficult for me to even have a conversation, because for me, it's a state of emergency. For me, we need that sense of urgency. These massacres are taking place before our very eyes. We ought to be on fire. We ought to be deeply concerned.
Let me ask you this. Would you have said the same thing if this airman had killed himself in this manner outside the Palestinian embassy in Washington, D.C., if there is one, or whatever the central location is for Palestinians in Washington, the day after October the 7th, and reversed it and said, I'm doing this in response to the horror committed by Hamas on Jewish people in Israel? Would you have felt the same way about what happened?
Oh, absolutely. Murder is murder, though, brother. That when you kill innocent people, when you kill civilians, those are crimes against humanity. Now, I have a larger indictment of Israeli apartheid. I have a larger indictment of the Israeli occupation of Palestinians. But anytime any organized group kills innocent people, especially innocent children, I will be in opposition. That's true for U.S. troops. That's true for British troops. That's true for the IDF. That's true for Iranian troops. That's true for Chinese troops. That's true for Indian troops. Any organized army that kills innocent people, especially children, for me is murder. I'm morally consistent in that regard. And that therefore, if somebody kills themselves in order to call attention to the suffering of precious innocent people, especially precious innocent children, I am going to acknowledge that courage and say, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. And I don't mind being morally consistent and therefore having people thoroughly misunderstand me, because I do not look at the world through a narrow set of ideological lens. I try to stay in contact with the humanity of all innocent people and all children, no matter what color, Palestinian, Israeli, Ethiopian, Guatemalan. I fundamentally believe that a Palestinian baby has the same value as an Israeli baby. The problem is, you and I know that if Palestinians were doing this to Israelis, Biden, Harris, Blinken, all of these folks who are enabling this genocide, enabling these crimes against humanity, they would have a very different view, because they're not morally consistent. They don't believe that a Palestinian life has the same value as an Israeli.
Well, I certainly do, but I certainly think I certainly do, but I also believe that the purest definition of genocide is Hamas's view of Jewish people in Israel.
Okay, so we're gonna pause there. We're gonna circle back around here. I'll rewind a little bit so we can address that point. On the point that Cornel West was just saying, the only thing that I would disagree with, because obviously I agree with him that regardless of who is committing a war crime, who is killing an innocent child, obviously that's condemnable, regardless of whatever the situation is. Okay, point blank, period. The only way that I would have disagreed with him is that in Piers Morgan's framing of the question there, of if Aaron Bushnell had done this, to protest Hamas's attack on October 7th, would you have the same opinion? In my opinion, at least, no. I mean, I wouldn't. For basically just the reason that Cornel West kind of alluded to there, which is that, number one, my government is not arming and funding Hamas, okay? So for a U.S. soldier to go and self-immolate outside of a Palestinian embassy to protest Hamas's attack on October 7th, it wouldn't make any sense. The reason, according to Aaron Bushnell himself, that he engaged in that act was to protest U.S. complicity in the genocide in Gaza that's being committed by Israel. And that's a fact, that the United States is complicit in that. So it makes sense in that way that you would engage in an extreme form of protest because your government is complicit in a genocide. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to engage in that kind of a protest to do what exactly? To show your anger or your disgust at Hamas, an organization that the United States of America is vehemently opposed to in every way, shape, and form. It's like, who exactly would be the target of that kind of a protest? You're going to go and protest the Palestinian embassy? Is that the goal? This is like, it's something that's repeated in many other circumstances as well, where people will, John Fetterman, for example, this delusional psychopath recently when it comes to the issue of Israel, Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, he brings this up all the time in response to people who go out there and protest for a ceasefire in Gaza. And he says, why aren't you guys protesting Hamas? And it's like, what the fuck would a protest by Americans against Hamas accomplish in any way, shape, and form? Hamas does not give a single solitary shit what the American people think about, their actions, okay? Point blank, period. The American government is funding and arming and giving diplomatic cover and cover at the United Nations to one of these sides, and it's not Hamas, it is Israel. So to pretend as if these are equal equations and that protests against Israeli genocide should be equated to hypothetical protests against Hamas, it's just nonsense, okay? You're protesting, effectively, if you go out and protest Hamas, you are protesting in favor of the position that the U.S. government is already taking, okay? To an absurd extent, to the point where they are now complicit in a genocide. But they continue here. So let's rewind a little bit to get Piers Morgan's question.
Life has the same value as an Israeli.
Well, I certainly do, but I certainly think I certainly do, but I also believe that the purest definition of genocide is Hamas's view of Jewish people in Israel. They want to get rid of all of them. They've made it very clear publicly since October the 7th that they want to commit that kind of atrocity again and again and again and just get rid of all Jewish people in Israel. That actually is the purest definition of genocide, isn't it?
Well, genocide has to do with intent as well as execution.
But you accept that Hamas are genocidal in their intent?
When Hamas was founded in 1988 as a response to a vicious Israeli occupation, they were wrong. They were calling for the forms of violent resistance that too often did include killing innocent folk, because, of course, innocent Palestinians have been killed for 75 years by the IDF and others. They did change their charter. There's been struggles within the Hamas itself, and the Palestinian people themselves are, how would you put it? The Palestinian people themselves are resisting with tremendous dignity, and Hamas has emerged as a major institutional vehicle. And that institutional vehicle, for me, does involve crimes against humanity when they kill innocent folk.
Well, they've emerged. Let's be clear. Let's be clear. They've emerged as a terrorist organization committing acts of mass terrorism. That's what they are.
No, Hamas is a counter-terrorist group responding to the terrorism of the IDF and responding to the terrorism of the Israeli state. A counter-terrorist group can commit war crimes, brother, but they didn't initiate it at all. If they're founded in 1988 and the terrorism began in 1948 with the state of Israel, that's 40 whole years.
Yeah,
and let's keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's a stretch to call them counter. I think it's a stretch with
undermine the PLO, undermine secular nationalism, promote fundamentalist Islam as a way of dividing Palestinians. That's why Netanyahu allowed for Gaza, allowed for Hamas to gain access to the money from Qatar and others.
Yeah, I agree.
To keep the Palestinians divided and therefore not having to move to deal with the suffering.
Dr. West, there are many things that we would find agreement on about the way Palestinians have been treated for a very long time. It has been a completely unacceptable occupation. It should not have dragged on. But hang on. Let me finish. I know. Ugly. Let me finish. But the idea that you categorize Hamas after October 7th as counter-terrorists is ridiculous. They are terrorists, and they should be called what they are. Anyway,
but let me ask you: do you think the IDF is terrorists when they kill innocent Palestinians?
I think it depends.
Yes or no, my brother? Yes or no?
Well, okay. I would ask you this. If you
yes or no? Yes or no?
Hang on.
You're uncensored. You're uncensored,
yes,
my brother.
And I've been asked this question before. I have actually tweeted in 2014. I tweeted that what Israel was doing then was bordering on terrorism. I'm not afraid of using that analogy.
Bordering on terrorism.
Yeah, but hang on.
The children are being killed, brother.
Yes, of course. There were children killed on October the 7th. I have serious misgivings about what's happening currently in Gaza, like most people. But what I would say to you, if you were the head of the Israeli government on October the 7th, out of interest, what would your response have been to that horrendous terror attack?
Okay. So we'll get to his response to that, but there was a lot about what Piers Morgan just said there, right? So, and to Cornel West's credit, there's no other person who's running. He's running for president right now. There's no other person in the presidential race who would even come close to spitting facts in the way that he is right now about the entire history of Israel and Palestine and how we got to the point where October 7th was an attack that even happened in the first place. Now, let's just be clear about this, okay? When he describes Hamas as engaging in counterterrorism on October 7th, okay, what he's not saying is that Hamas going into Israel and killing, in many cases, innocent civilians, he's not saying that that is good or moral or acceptable. In fact, he just characterized it as a war crime. So he's not endorsing the killing of civilians, to be very clear about this. But what he is saying is that if you look at the entire history from Israel's foundation and even the earlier stages of Zionism in the early, 20th century, but leading up to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the Nakba, and then the, 1967 war and the illegal occupation that has existed ever since, if you look at the brutality and the terrorism that Israel has engaged in against the Palestinian people, a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and keeping people confined into what is effectively the world's largest open-air prison or a concentration camp inside of Gaza, what he's saying is that when you look at the entire history of this, okay, number one, history didn't start on October 7th, and you can't possibly say that Hamas instigated this unless you're completely ignoring the entire history of Israeli aggression prior to October 7th. But then number two is that, if you keep people confined in the world's largest open-air prison, if you keep people under illegal and brutal and violent occupation, if you are engaging in a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing of a group of people, guess what's going to happen? When you have violent institutions in place like that, when violence is a matter of your government's and state's policy, then violence is going to be bred from that. Violence is going to come in return as a result of that. That's the point that he's making there. And so the reality of it is that what he's really calling for here is just a deeper reflection on how do we actually solve the issue at hand here, right? And the answer, I think, in his view, would be to end the illegal occupation, end the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, end the genocide in Gaza right now, and actually give Palestinians a peaceful path forward so that a group like Hamas would have absolutely no reason to come to power in the first place, to give them a peaceful path forward towards real sovereignty, towards real dignity, towards a right to return, and all of the rest of that Palestinians, I think, obviously deserve. Piers Morgan, on the other hand, basically when he's confronted with the notion that Cornel West would call the IDF terrorists, okay, or that they're engaging in terrorist activities, while simultaneously pretending to have this moral, principled stance on the issue, notice how when he talks about Hamas, it's easy for him. It's very simple. They're terrorists. They're a terrorist organization. But then when he's presented with the alternative of the IDF being a terrorist organization, he said, there's certain things that I have an issue with. And in previous instances, a decade ago, I said that they were bordering on terrorism. I mean, it's all of this like bullshit self-justification excuses to not call the IDF a terrorist organization. If Hamas is a terrorist organization, then the IDF is a super terrorist organization. Now, I have an issue with the term terrorism, just at a fundamental level, because it's usually only wielded as a political tool, as a geopolitical weapon against the U.S. Government or the Israeli government or Western government's enemies, right? Because when these groups that we've designated as terrorists do something, then they're engaged in terrorist activities. But when we go and we obliterate civilians, then that's not terrorism. That's somehow like self-defense, right? And that's the issue that Cornel West is trying to get him to answer to here. If you call Hamas, this brutal, evil terrorist organization whose sole goal is to genocide the Jewish people, and then you look at what they did in their most brutal attack in modern history, October 7th, and you look at the casualties on that day, okay? And I brought this up before. You can look at the numbers, guys. It was about 770 or so to 800 civilians that were killed on that day. There were a few hundred, I think it was around 300 IDF soldiers or military officials who were killed on that day as well as part of that attack. So when you do the math, in a total sense, you have Hamas killing about 700, 800 or so civilians, right? Obviously, that's a war crime. You can't go around killing civilians, regardless of what the circumstance is. Since October 7th, Israel has killed minimum over 30,000 civilians, including over 14,000 children, okay? And that is a drastic underestimate. Because of how brutal Israel's genocidal offensive into Gaza has been, we can't even get an accurate update on the numbers of how many have been killed. So it could be tens of thousands higher than that 30,000 estimate and the 14,000 dead kids, okay? In Hamas's attack inside of Israel, even though we heard these claims that were later debunked about 40 beheaded babies and all of this and that, the actual numbers show around 36 children were killed by Hamas on October 7th. Again, 36 children on October 7th. That's terrible. That's a war crime. What has Israel done since that war crime? Okay, they have gone into Gaza and killed incalculably more children. Okay, 2/3 of the people they've killed in Gaza have been women and children. That doesn't even include the innocent men. When you include the innocent men, it gets upwards of like 80-90% of the people they've killed in Gaza have been civilians. So both in a total sense, on the destruction to civilian life and civilian infrastructure for that matter, and also in a proportionate sense, as a percentage, Israel has killed more civilians. They have engaged in more acts of terrorism. And if you don't want to take my word for it, if you don't believe the statistics or whatever the case may be, I mean, you can look at statements from Israeli officials. This was, and I highly recommend everybody goes and reads this fantastic 972 magazine article. It was called The Mass Assassination Factory, okay? And they refer to things like this, right? Compared to previous Israeli assaults on Gaza, the current war, which Israel has named Operation Iron Swords, which began after the October 7th attack, has seen the army significantly expand its bombing of targets that are not distinctly military in nature. These include private residences, as well as public buildings, infrastructure, and high-rise blocks, which sources say the army defines as power targets. The bombing of power targets, according to intelligence sources who had first-hand experience with its application in Gaza in the past, is mainly intended to harm Palestinian civil society, to, quote, create a shock that, among other things, will reverberate powerfully and lead to civilians putting pressure on Hamas. This is the definition of terrorism. By any metric, you are intentionally attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure in order to achieve some sort of a political aim. In this case, it would be to turn the civilian population of Gaza against Hamas. Now, not only is that terrorism, but it's also not effective. It's not going to work. If anything, you are turning the civilian population in Gaza more and more against you. And we've seen this in previous Israeli offensives as well, where whenever the violence boils up, whenever Israel launches these bombing campaigns inside of Gaza, the support for Hamas also goes up, because they are viewed as basically the only violent resistance to an illegal, decades-long Israeli occupation and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. So it's not effective, it's also immoral, and it also fits very well under the definition of terrorism. Now, I'll link this down below as well if you guys want to go refresh yourselves on some of the openly genocidal statements that we've gotten from guys like Yoav Galat, the Minister of Defense of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, Isaac Herzog, the President. We've all talked about this, whether it's in the ICJ, genocide case against Israel. We've talked about these statements over and over and over again, where Israel and their officials and their military members and their soldiers have just openly admitted their genocidal intent in Gaza. So to frame that as some sort of like borderline terrorism or something where I have some disagreements with them on, no, it's a genocide. It's terrorism, and it is terrorism at a scale that is incomparable to anything that Hamas has ever done, okay? Even while acknowledging that Hamas did commit war crimes. So, anyways, I know that was a long tangent there. Let's go ahead and finish off.
I'll tell you the answer to that question, but I don't know why you just can't say the IDF is terrorist killers and innocent people bordering on it's wrong. No, why, you're uncensored. You're a free man. Tell the truth from your soul.
I'm telling the truth.
Let me tell you what I would do if I was in Israel. I would end the occupation. I would end the siege. I was saying I'm committed to Palestinian dignity. I'm committed to Palestinian equality. And we Palestinians and Israelis, we Jews and Palestinians, we're going to learn how to live together in the context of equality and dignity. We're going to have Jewish safety. We're going to have Jewish security. That's the very end and aim of Israel. We'll never see an annihilation of Jews. We'll never see another massacre or Holocaust of Jews, but we'll never see annihilation and massacre and vicious attacks on Palestinians either. That's what I would do.
Well, on that,
not just as head of Israel. That's what I'll do in the White House, brother. That's what I'll do in the White House. And I'll explain to American people why it is that Biden and Harris and others continue to enable this genocide. And then when they finally say ceasefire, they act like we ought to give them a moral prize or something after 30,000 precious people have already been killed.
Yeah, listen, there's a lot that you say that I agree with, just to be clear, okay?
No, I hear you.
Okay, I just want to read you what Ben Shapiro said about your tweet, though, about Aaron Bushnell. He said, our political environment is facilitating dangerous insanity. It is easy enough for people like Cornel West to celebrate the pseudo-heroism of disturbed people lighting themselves on fire, but both the mentally disturbed and our society pay the price for such celebration. I mean, he has a point, doesn't he? You wouldn't want other people to go and set fire to themselves and kill themselves like he did, would you?
Brother, I have deep libertarian sensibilities. I believe that people make choices and they have to take responsibilities. They make decisions, they have to deal with the consequences. I do not promote people killing themselves, not at all. But people do a number of different things. I would want to ask Brother Shapiro. He's talking about there's heroes in the Israeli Defense Forces, many of whom are killing innocent children. Do I think that's sick? Yes, that is morally bankrupt. It is spiritually empty. It is ethically vacuous. I come right back at Shapiro. Your heroes happen to be engaged in terrorist activity against Palestinians. And you're going to say, Aaron's not a hero. Aaron is a particular person who exercised a certain kind of witness and ended up taking the form of killing himself in order not to bring attention to himself, but to try to give some sense of urgency for a genocide.
Do you believe Aaron Bushnell?
That's what Brother Shapiro doesn't want to focus on.
Do you believe
Shapiro still wants to hide his indifference to the suffering of Palestinians in the form of attacking
Okay, let me ask you.
How cowardly can you get, my brother?
Do you believe that Aaron Bushnell is a martyr?
Well, martyr and witness really have the same root, as you know, in the Greek. And martyr means someone who pays an ultimate cost tied to a higher cause. I believe trying to bring attention to genocide and bring genocide to a close is a higher cause.
Okay, so, I mean, we'll finish it off there. Now, in terms of the Ben Shapiro quote, which for some reason Piers Morgan decided to bring up, Cornel West was, again, 100% correct, right? The idea that somehow, saying that Aaron Bushnell was courageous, or that the cause that he decided to go out and engage in that form of protest for, was a valid cause, that is somehow, less moral than Ben Shapiro going out and praising the Israeli government and praising the IDF as they engage in a genocide. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous, right? It's not even hypocrisy. I mean, it is just to levels of absurdity that it's hard to even break it down. Right now, obviously, Ben Shapiro, he's a complete Israel supporter. He endorses every single thing that they want to do. He has no critiques for the government of Israel, for Netanyahu, I think, at least that I've seen. And so, I mean, I don't even know that it's something worth responding to there or even bringing up in this kind of a conversation. But at the baseline, of course, Piers Morgan, I appreciate at a fundamental level you continuing to have people on your show. He's brought on not only Cornel West, but Norm Finkelstein. And, later on in this video, he brought on Mustafa Barghouti. And he's brought on, even guys like Hassan Piker and Cenk and so many other people that I think do a pretty good job at having these kinds of conversations. So I do appreciate that Piers Morgan uses his large platform to not just suck off the government of Israel, but to bring on people who vehemently disagree with him. If he ever wants to have me on, I'm welcome to go on. I'm welcome to debate pretty much anybody. So, put that out there, I guess. But, I think that Cornel West is just joining in a long line of people who are, again, running circles around Piers Morgan. Piers just wants to sort of waffle in this middle ground, although he has trended, I think, more so since October 7th towards being critical of the Israeli government. But clearly there's a lot of ground that he still has to make up on this issue.